Welcome to Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast, where we meet experts from all walks of life to learn their intrinsic motivation so that they can share it with the world. What do we have in store today? Stay tuned to find out more. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody out there in podcast land. This is Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. I am Hamza.
And I am David.
And today we have a good friend, Dr. Gail Lash, and I know her from Horizon, way back in 2009. I think I first met her, or met you, Gail, but let me give everyone your credentials so they are more familiar with you as well. Gail is known as a peace explorer. She's also the author of Ops for Peace, 9 Essential Steps to Achieving Peace, Power, and Prosperity. Her formal background is at Duke University. She worked as a biologist with the Lemur Facility. She's been a zookeeper, has over 20 years experience working with zoos, aquariums, schools, other organizations. She is the official Places of Peace, and she's created peace parks, and she has world trips around the world. You guys are in for a treat. Without further ado, Dr. Gail Lash, welcome to the podcast.
Welcome. I'm so happy to be here. It's great to see you, Hamza and David, or, talk with you.
We're glad to have you.
Oh, my goodness. So we have lots to talk about. Let's talk about peace.
Let's talk about peace. Well, let's just talk about pedigree at first because, we speak with people all over, and I was really interested in interviewing you just because I know you so well, and I always am open to learning new information, which you always bring. And I love your background because in my former life as well, corporate, we designed animal facilities. So we did a lot of animal research and just educating the public as opposed to going places and throwing paint on people for wearing fur coats and such. So a totally different world back then. And when I started Horizon, I think you were already ahead of me, and we've both taken some gym self classes. I know you've taken extensive classes. I want to cover that as well. Mm-hmm. So let's go back. Let's start with Duke University, your animal background and how it led you to the Tourism for Peace.
Well, it's interesting you use the word pedigree because at Duke, actually, I was studying animal behavior. I was a zoology major, and there was this gentleman who had just come back from Madagascar studying lemurs, and Duke did have, and still does actually have, the largest lemur facility in the world, where they really study lemurs, which are a prosimian, a pre-primate, only exist on the island of Madagascar off the east coast of Africa. And so it's a wonderful resource to do research on lemurs, and I was doing that, and he came in from Madagascar. He was working on his graduate degree, and he brought back these little dogs that are white, fluffy dogs. They have hair like cotton. It's very dry, no oils. They're about 15 pounds or so, called the coton de Tuléar. Tuléar is a city in Madagascar, and coton means cotton in French. And he brought these into the United States, and because he was there for a couple of years, he fell in love with the dog. It is the royal dog of Madagascar, and it's on a stamp. It's only the people of the royalty were allowed to own this dog. And of course, Madagascar in years past was a kings and queens lineages, so only the royal courts were allowed to own the breed. And then when it became a French colony, of course, all the French landowners and politicians, etc., brought the dog to Europe. And then this gentleman, J. Russell, brought it to the United States. So I met the dog there, and I met Jay there. Started dating him. After I finished dating him, I actually had a dog. So dropped the man, kept the dog, but it was a great relationship. So actually I've been breeding coton de Tuléar dogs, my husband and I, for almost 40 years. Oh my God, I'm telling my age, but nevertheless. And they're just wonderful. They're in the Bichon family. So they look kind of like a Bichon frise with short hair. So that's a long story, but pedigree, very familiar with that as a biologist and an animal behaviorist. Fell in love with wildlife as a kid when I used to go around to our little neighborhood pond and just sit and feed the ducks and commune with the nature and talk to the trees and the animals. And I know we'll get into some of that spiritual stuff in a minute. But that sent me on a path of being a biologist. And, being a biologist, when you go out there and with a degree in biology, what do you do with it is a big question. So I had always wanted to work in zoos, but to get into a zoo actually is quite difficult. I grew up in Houston, Texas, and the Houston Zoo is a really nice zoo. You had to take get on a waiting list to be interviewed and then volunteer for a while, and I did. But in the meantime, before they were hiring, before a new job would come open and I was able to get a job there, I worked at MD Anderson Hospital, which is in Houston. That's a premier cancer institute hospital, as a pharmacy technician. I walked in just fresh out of Duke University, and they said, "Oh, you have a biology degree. We can teach you how to be a pharmacy tech." So that was an interesting time to work there in various units of the hospital, learning about pharmaceuticals and healing from the allopathic medical profession. And then I did get the job at the zoo, so that was a lot of fun.
I want to ask you, MD Anderson was a former client of mine, and it was just really interesting. A brief story is that, like you said, it's the premier cancer research institution in the world, and people would fly all over the world to get there. And I remember one morning we were meeting with some execs or whatever, and we're at the hotel and we're waiting for a valet to bring the car around. And they had a brief strip where people would actually, kind of just sit and wait for their car or walk between buildings. And it was just always interesting to watch some of these people who had just undergone cancer surgery, and yet they were still standing on that path smoking. And I was just wondering, with your, understanding animal behavior, understanding human behavior, spirituality, so on and so forth, what was your experience at MD Anderson? And that's that can grow into a cushy job. So it sounds like you were really into the whole animal behavior and working with the zoos, whereas others may have just stayed at MD Anderson we may have never met.
You're correct. It's interesting because that whole medical hospital facilities, the Houston Medical Center is huge and certainly is not just MD Anderson. It's many, many other hospitals together with many different specialties. And as a kid, I had gone there because I have scoliosis and had to have rods put in my back with fused vertebrae. And the person who actually invented the rods to to alleviate scoliosis was Dr. Harrington, and he was based at the Houston Medical Center. So those amazing, it's an amazing medical facility. But, we all have our human behavior. What can I say? We get roped into habits that we each are really comfortable with. And so, you mentioned smoking outside if they've just coming out from having cancer treatment and suddenly revert back to these human behaviors that we all feel comfortable. But obviously it's about starting something new. That's the opportunity of any illness, if you will, is to say, okay, what's working, what's not, and how can I modify my life and maybe be a little bit different.
And so when you got the call back that you were able to work at the zoo, what were you thinking as far as, this is my destiny, I always loved animals as a child, this is where I'm going to go, whereas your parents, maybe your friends may have been, what are you thinking? Why aren't you staying at MD Anderson? What's going on?
You are absolutely correct. It's like, why go work at a zoo? So animals to me are magical. It is just an amazing to be close to another species that is so very much like us but so very different. Is just amazing. And I know as a kid, when I was out there sitting by that natural pond, that little pond at the neighborhood, that I know I was talking to the ducks and the trees. And even though I didn't consciously do so. We all have this clairvoyance, this sixth sense, this inner knowing, and we can talk to animals, and we do it all the time to our pets. They pick up on our thoughts and our wishes, or they pick up on our energy, which is huge. But I know that when I got the job, I volunteered, as I said, for a while. I worked in the small mammal house with all the different small species like squirrels and marmosets and bats and just all these cool little small species. And then I worked in the children's zoo and was able to raise a baby camel, go in at all hours to feed it bottles of milk and raise it, and just some really wonderful species there, and as well as the animals used for the schools, the prairie dogs and the snakes and the turtles and the ferrets and all those that you would take into a school setting to explain about different animals, mainly mammals, some reptiles, etc., a few birds. But it's just, they're magical. They have a way of calming me and calming people they're around. And they have a way of bringing us in touch with nature and really reminding us that we're part of the earth. We're part of this whole big ecosystem called Earth, and getting out of the stress, if you will, of daily life. So yeah, when the zoo called up and said, okay, we have an opening now, we know who you are and you can actually come work for us now for paid salary, which wasn't very much at all and still isn't, for unfortunately zoo people aren't paid very much. But it is, it was a calling, it was a destiny. It was, yes, I can now be with my animals. And most zookeepers, when they are taking care of the animals, really don't, I'm going to say something pretty controversial here, they really don't care about the people who come to the zoo. In other words, we used to really love it as a keeper when you would come into the zoo in the morning and be cleaning up everything and getting it ready for the visitors to come in at 9 o'clock in the morning. We'd get there at 7 or something like that. And here we'd walk around and it'd be so wonderfully silent and quiet, except for, of course, the animal noises and the bird songs and just the sacredness of the outdoor environment. And so it's like, gee, couldn't it just remain this way before the little screaming kids come and the people with their popcorn? And and so it obviously it's a beautiful place to have educational lessons and entertainment for people and to teach conservation. And I will say that those zoos that are part of the American Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the AZA.org, you can go to that, is an accredited national organization for the United States that has about 215 zoos or so that meet the high standards. So we're talking about zoos here that really are professional, that all the animal food is basically human quality. It's really amazing food. They are in social settings that are appropriate for that particular species. They're in a habitat that is a naturalistic habitat. The conservation programs are front and center with the zoo board and the dollars that they put out there for research. In situ conservation, which means that, I may have a Bali myna here in a myna bird that is an exhibit at the zoo, but there's actually a funding program in Bali that's helping preserve those animals in the wild as well in Indonesia. So those types of programs are very relevant and prevalent in these accredited zoos. Did you ever go to a zoo as a kid? Either one of you?
Oh, but of course.
Yeah.
So what did you like about the zoo?
Well, my favorite thing was playing with the, what was it? I think they were lion cubs. And that's that, and like feeding one of the elephants. I was pretty young, but those two memories kind of stand out.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
Yeah. It's just amazing that, I see elephants on TV and all of a sudden here was one like right in front of me.
Yeah, and they're big.
Yeah, that's right, very big. But he was real friendly, and since that time I've come to understand how how sensitive and emotional elephants can be. And, they have really good memories, and, they can get really, if they're, bred kind of in captivity, whatever, they can really get attached to their handlers and their owners. And they'll, if they're not around for a while, they can get really sad and emotional.
Yes.
People that care for them disappear for, a short amount of time, they really kind of get,
Yes, you're correct. It's very similar to where in India, of course, the mahouts are the caretakers of the animals, and they are with that animal for basically the life of the animal. And it is that amazing bond that is developed. And that's what's so special about being a zookeeper, is this bond between yourself and the animal. I remember when I worked at the Los Angeles Zoo, when I moved from Houston to L.A., I again had to wait because L.A. has a test that you have to take and pass, and then they hire off the scores that you make on the test, and they only give the test every 4 years. So I came there, and they had just given the test, and I went, darn, okay, back to pharmacy. So I worked at UCLA Hospital for a while and another local hospital in Los Angeles for the 4 years while waiting for the test, and then took the test and was third on the scale to be hired. And then so I had to wait another year or two before I actually got hired. So it was working with pharmacy again for a while. So that came in handy. But then at the Los Angeles Zoo, the collection is amazing. The animals that are there, and I just called it a collection, but it really is about showcasing the diversity of wildlife around the planet. And Los Angeles has an amazing array of really well-done exhibits and really well-done breeding programs for various species. And so I just remember it was wonderful. I started out in the marmoset colony, which was all about learning how these small primates, which are from South America, of various species, can exist and be bred and then reintroduced back into the wild. So they actually had quite a number of programs working with introducing them back into Brazil and those areas. And then I worked with, I kind of moved all over that zoo, which was wonderful. But I worked with, at one point in the nursery, and there were a couple of baby orangutans there. That there was one orangutan that the male loved to mate with her and get her pregnant, and she had babies, but she could not raise them her own. She was just not psychologically capable of taking care of her young. So they were always pulled and brought to the nursery. And then when they got to be maybe 4 years old or so, they were put back in with the orangutan group. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to work with them in the nursery. And then when I had been there for a few years, I actually was assigned to the orangutan regular habitat and group. And it was about I want to say 8 or 9 orangutans in the major group. And so we put the young ones in there, and the head keeper was going, well, you know them well. Let's see if you can walk in with them. And I walked in with them, and of course they hugged me, and they greeted me. They're like, oh, yes, we know who you are. You raised us when you were a kid, And they grabbed my legs, and they immediately picked me up and lifted me off the ground. And I went, uh-oh, can't go in with you anymore. Too strong.
Yeah.
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 So we develop these attachments, but have to realize they are wild animals too, and have certain superpowers in many cases.
I want to go back because David was talking about elephants, and so I'd like to get your take on the age-old story of elephants in captivity. And just as a brief foundation for listeners, is that you have an elephant, I think it was either at the zoo or it was at the circus, and it was taken into captivity, and it was put into this, it was attached to a stake in the ground, and it was really hard for the elephant to get out, and then it just realized that was a lot, like it couldn't escape. And then the zookeepers, I guess at the time, or the circus people, realized that it was a mental thing. So they could get a child or a baby elephant and attach them to the same stake, and as a younger baby elephant, they could never get out. But they were so into being into captivity that if there were a fire or anything else, they would actually die, because mentally, I mean, they're strong enough to get through that stake, but mentally they realized they couldn't do it. And so I wanted to share that story because there's a lot of correlation between the human experience and elephants with that story. And as an animal behaviorist, I wanted to get your take on that.
Well, we often stake ourselves into the ground and don't get out of situations that we probably should or certainly could, but we don't take the choice to do so. So in many regards, you're absolutely right. It has great parallels to the human condition. As far as elephants in captivity, they've come a long way. So the zoos and circuses have in the past been menageries, been simply a way for a king or queen or someone of a wealthy estate to simply show different species around the world, and elephants have been used obviously to go across continents and help as a war machine, to just be these workhorses, if you will, like in India. And do manual labor, animal labor, but these hard things of moving logs and trees and whatever, they're very strong. We have, as a human species, domesticated, if you will, or certainly used a lot of species to be our helpers in our human condition as a weak primate on the planet. And so elephants have been taken into captivity, and unfortunately, if they're not treated well, and in most cases they're not, it's extremely sad. It's extremely horrible because they are very smart and intelligent beings, and they have a great memory, as you said, and they live to be 60 years old. So, we're talking a very long-lived animal here that exists in not only a wild open spaces, but in this herd, so is one of a matriarchal pack. The males tend to move in and out of the herds that are run by the females, but you have this sense of community and camaraderie that is all about elephants. And so certainly if they are in captivity, the ones that you see that are older probably did come from the wild when they were young and used to be staked to the ground. Now they're not chained up at night. They are given free rein in these open habitats or these buildings. But and that's what I mean, elephant care has come a long way to have where keepers used to go in with them and use onks, use the hook to train them, if you will, or to guide them. It can be used as a weapon, but that obviously is cruelty. It can be used as a gentle guide of, I want you to bring your foot over here so I can trim your foot, because if they don't get their feet trimmed, they can develop cracks and really horrible, painful, experience of walking. So there's different cares that humans have to do for these animals that are not able to be in these wide open spaces and wear down their feet in a natural way. For example, just like we clip our dog's nails because they're in captivity and they don't wear them down. It is, though, that when you bring an elephant in with another elephant, you're beginning a herd. So you're beginning that bonding and that closeness that is really necessary for their psychological well-being, and giving them things to do, obviously, just like you would if you were confined to your house or your neighborhood for your life. You would want to have a lot of stimulation as well. So zoos are controversial, and yet they do, in my mind at least, have a great role to play for our urban populations of humanity that will never get out to the wild and see these species. And now, most of the time, the animals you see in zoos were bred in the zoos purposefully. So the genetic diversity is managed on a national or global collection so that we are not, so that if they ever were introduced into the wild, they certainly would be the best of that species that they could be. They wouldn't be, breeding an aunt and a niece, or they wouldn't be breeding ones that were so closely together. In other words, they're not the having good genetics. So there's a whole bunch of science behind it as well, is my point. But you really want to establish these herds or these conditions, and so zoos are constantly updating their habitats and bringing them into a new era. So, for example, the Zoo Atlanta here in Atlanta, Georgia, had an elephant facility that was very small and had 3 female elephants, because having a bull is really hard to do. They go into musk, they get violent, they get very, when they're in their sexual prime and they go into musk, they can be quite dangerous. In fact, the most keepers ever killed in a zoo, or the animal that kills the most keepers, is the elephant, because they are so smart and they are so huge, and they're cunning. If they really do get pissed off, you're in trouble. So so generally zoos keep females together, or they'll have a bachelor herd. And so Zoo Atlanta had a smaller exhibit, and then in the 1980s, it was the late 1980s, they developed a natural habitat for the elephants, which was rock work and a pool and really a nice night house that gave them places to walk around where they didn't have to be chained up, as I said, and then other outdoor exhibit areas so they could get away from each other and they could also be together. And it was really state of the art for that time. But now the zoo has petitioned the city and actually obtained 3 more acres into the park that the zoo is part of, and taken over the old Cyclorama building, which is this huge historical building that held this circular painting from the late 1800s of the burning of Atlanta that was about 50 feet tall and about, 360 feet, it was a huge circular painting. That moved to the History Center. Now the Cyclorama is owned by the zoo and will become an event center for large events that people can rent out, of 1,000 people sitting down to a dinner, for example, or conferences, with windows looking out on a new African savanna that houses a new whole elephant exhibit that is over 3 acres and has a bull section and a cow section that they can mingle together, but they can also be separate. So zoos constantly are evolving to these, what can we do to better the quality of life for these animals? And most of the time they're bred in captivity, so they haven't come from the wild as a captive animal. They really are bred and exchanged around the world or around the United States to make sure, as I said, the genetic diversity is the best it can be.
There was an episode on 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago, and it was really interesting to watch because, we as humans are enamored with our phones, and we use our apps and dating apps and all that. And 60 Minutes was making the correlation with the apps and software that the zoos and other habitats were using for mating. It was more of, like you said, that genetic diversity and looking at combining that with their natural habitats to find an ideal or the best animal it could be, I guess, quote unquote. So it's just really interesting that there's always these parallels between the animal kingdom and the human kingdom.
Well, we are an animal as well. Yeah. We forget that we're part of this greater whole, this ecological system in many regards, because we have the ability to change and disrupt and, quote, improve and modify our ecological reality in our living earth. But when we start to think about the living waters, the way I was interviewing a lady from Keepers of the Waters, Betsy Damon, and she has this amazing capacity and technology to map where water exists. So let me explain. If you have, like here in Atlanta, Georgia, she would come in if we chose to have her come in and map. Where is it underground? Where is it piped? Where does it come up in springs? Where is it in a lake or a river? Where is it being used for municipal waste? Where is it being used for drinking water? Where is it, where is our water? And she believes that all development needs to stem around water and where it naturally flows, and to preserve the natural flow along the land of the water and the purity, obviously, of water, because water is life. And so when you talk about the way humans use our landscape and animals use our landscape, we can learn a lot from the animals, how they help keep that cycle going, the purity of the water, the ecological system intact. We need to learn a lot from them, from their wisdom of how to use the environment.
So let me ask you, with that being said, because I'm trying to make that correlation between the captivity and versus being in their natural natural wildlife. And I'm thinking about the example in Thailand when they had that tsunami, what was it, about 15 years ago. And those that were tell the story that were there, they're sitting on the beach enjoying their vacation, and they noticed that the animals had kind of picked up and moved to higher ground. Right.
Yeah.
And the humans were kind of like, oh, well, that's peculiar, and then we know the rest of the story. So on what level would that animal growing up in that controlled environment still have that natural instinct where we would be aware of something that's amiss?
Well, that's a really good question, because, first of all, I think we all have this innate instinct if we would pay attention to it. It's various groups of people, for example, those who are really close to the land. If you talk about the First Nations or people who really live in a rural environment, they know the weather, they know the seasons, they know the area, and they can forecast what's coming by looking at the clouds or feeling a little bit of change in the temperature or the moisture in the air. We just don't pay attention to that very much in our urban environments because, first of all, it's mainly controlled. You walk into an AC condition, into a house, et cetera, or an office building. So I think as far as animals in captivity in these zoos or these situations, but even our dogs, they sense when an earthquake is coming or when the barometric pressure drops and a storm is approaching. They have that innate ability to understand. And, of course, as I said, so do we, but we don't practice it or pay attention to it. As far as, though, an animal in a situation under human care, whether it be pets or a zoo or wherever, a natural wildlife place, they are kind of in that what I would call part domestic, part wild. I actually wrote a paper on that in graduate school. Just looking at environmental policy and how we deal with the way we view animals. So wild animals have one psyche, if we will, or one way we look at them as the pinnacle. Obviously, if you want to look at them from a spiritual point of view, they're our brothers and our sisters. If you want to look at them as a resource, they're the wild. We have to conquer them, perhaps, or work with them, or kill them, depending on, like, wolves in Yellowstone. And so you've got, these amazing ways we look at animals, and then we look at domesticated animals that we completely have control over, whether they be ones we use for food, like cows and chickens and pigs, or whether they be ones we use for our companion, like, birds and dogs and cats and ferrets and whatever, that the ones in between, the ones that are wild but in human care, like in a zoological park, are kind of both in my mind. And because they've known perhaps nothing else than being under human care, they are very attached to their human keepers. They are very attached to their group that they're in. That's their family. They have certain behaviors and certain experiences that they have every day, and that they change, and it does change with the seasons and year to year. But by and large, of course, they don't experience the same wild experience that their wild counterparts would. So they're kind of stuck in between. But I think they still have that instinct that would know if a tsunami was coming or would know if the weather was changing. I think we can learn a lot from them, just as we need to tune into those capacities as well.
Awesome. And so I kind of was leading you to go down that road because I wanted you to talk about the tourism for peace, but I also wanted to get your take on, just in your media piece, and we hear this in the conversation a lot today, that statistics show that the world is getting slightly more violent each year, and there's countries that spend 50 times more money on combating violence than investing in peace. And I wanted to get your take on maybe observing, and maybe animals are telling us something that is right under our noses to be aware of. So before you answer that, go into the tourism of peace, and then we can go down this other tangent.
Sure. So Tourism for Peace was born in 2003 when I was in Switzerland taking a peace course with the University of Landegg. It was a course called Education for Peace that was piloted in Herzegovina, Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the schools to talk about how does peace relate to every subject that children are taught in school, from your math classes, your history classes, your geometry classes, your PE classes. How does it relate to the language, etc.? And to be able to teach children that peace is really part of all of our daily lives and how we can start to get along. And of course, different ethnicities, when they're warring with each other, it's how do you get to know your neighbor and create that peaceful interaction and that peaceful places. So we were challenged with that course, Education for Peace, to create our own brand, if you will, our own service of how we can be peacemakers and peace builders around the world. And so because my background is in ecotourism, that's what led me from going from the zoos into my graduate work. Really, I realized when I studied environmental policy, and if I wanted to protect the animals where they actually lived, I had to work with the people. Remember I told you as a zookeeper, I didn't really care about the people who came to the zoo. I just wanted to be there with the animals. Mm-hmm. And when the visitors came in, it was kind of okay, granted, they're paying their way in the door and they're paying my salary, but I really would prefer that nice quiet in the morning before the visitors come. But I realized with just the cycle of life, like, oops, I got to work with the people who live where these animals are in India or Bali or Tanzania, whatever, that we have to uplift them and their society before conservation can ever survive. So it's about. So I got involved in tourism, in ecotourism, which is basically tourism based on the natural wildlife, based on your forests and your water and all the wonderful elements of that ecology we've been speaking about, and of course the animals there. So I worked in Belize, I worked in Ecuador, did some work in Indonesia, and realized that in my travels around the world and going to many conferences and in many different countries, that we're all basically the same. We're human beings. We want the same things for our families. We all want, of course, security and a good job, and we want our kids to be educated. We want the ability to have all that we need as far as our basic necessities at the very least, and we want to be creative. We want to make a difference in the world. So, how can we do that? What's your unique talents? So basically, Tourism for Peace was started to address those kinds of issues. How can we get to know each other around the planet? How can we honor the diversity of the animal kingdom, but also the diversity of the human race and the cultural differences that we are, and get to understand each other? So I started out giving some tours, I was also in a spiritual quest at that time of graduating, finishing my PhD, starting at Horizon Center, doing the work there, opening up to my clairvoyance, which I'd had all my whole life as I talked to the animals and trees around the pond at the neighborhood, but really opening up to those skills that we all have, and then realizing how can we do a service and get to know each other. So I ran several tours that were basically sacred tours, if you will, to get to know various places, get into the sacredness of Mother Earth and do meditation. Went to Belize and Brazil, and then several places in the United States. Arkansas has a huge crystal vortex and crystal beds underneath it. Has some very beautiful energies, so ran several tours there. And then realized I'm not a tour guide, I'm a nature lover and a spiritualist. So began teaching working in peace, because when we can get to know each other around the planet, we can create peace. So that's how that started.
Sure. And it totally makes sense, and you seem like the perfect person for it.
Well, and you mentioned go ahead.
No, I just like the fact that you're mirroring, or you're just leveraging all of your life experiences to the present day, right?
Exactly.
So you're using your traditional training, you're using your spiritual training, you're combining the two, and so that was where my second question was. And it could be just the perception out there is that it's getting statistically more violent, and I was just wondering what you were seeing as far as the animal kingdom reflecting what humans are currently going through, or is this more, it's a lot of sensationalism now because we have access to more and more news today, but how different is it than 100 years ago? We were in World War I at the time, or getting out of it, and the environment was pretty toxic at that time as well. So I was just seeing if you were seeing spiritually any correlation with animal behavior and what we're currently going through.
Well, so you bring up a lot of good points. So let me go through them one by one. We were talking just a minute ago about the Global Peace Index. Really, you can go look up the Global Peace Index by the Institute for Economics and Peace, puts it together and basically rates every country in the world about how peaceful is it, or rather how violent is it. They really look at violence in different forms and come up with who's got this sort of good peace index, this positive peace index, and who doesn't. And they find those countries with the high positive peace index really show high levels of human capital, sound business environments, low levels of corruption, free flow of information, good relations with neighbors, equitable distribution of resources. They're really getting along with each other, and they're quite prosperous and healthy societies. So we know that when we have a lot of peace, that humans actually can flourish and prosper. But what's happening around the world, and you mentioned about, the media, et cetera, is we're hearing so much more about the violence. And on this Global Peace Index, it looks like the number of countries that have sort of more violence than peace, if you will, has gone up slightly over the last couple years, like 2 or 3 more than were before. So they say it's rising. But then there's an amazing book that came out about 3 years ago, and it's called I'm trying to find it right here. It's called something like The Better Angels of Our Nature, and it's written by a Harvard economist, I believe, and his name escapes me right at the moment, I apologize. But he basically looked at the last couple hundred years of the human history all around the planet to see if we're getting more violent or whether there's more peace. And he actually claims that there is more peace now than ever before, like in human history, which you think about it is really bizarre, considering what our media outlets, are saying to us and what we're hearing. We're obviously getting this kind of scare, if you will, the scare tactic, like, oh yeah, this is again the us versus them, or the, my neighbor is my enemy. And in truth, what you and I are doing right now, all three of us, everyone on the show, is we're talking about peace. We're having a very peaceful conversation. Let's put it that way. We're not in war. We're not being harmed. We are actually just sitting around in our own environments having a great conversation. And in truth, most of our day is like that. Yeah. We're not in a situation, at least here in the United States, thank God, and many places around the world. And I will say, obviously, yes, there are many, many, many places around the world where people are not in that condition. They are being, in terror. They are in war. They are being violated. There is huge violence in various places around the world, particularly against women and children, and that's a whole other radio show. But in large, what he found out was that this index, and it's a whole different index that he put together. But again, the book is called something like The Better Angels of Our Nature. It's about, we really are in an age of peace, which I think has a lot to do with, at least the beginnings of an age of peace, has a lot to do with the raising of our consciousness. And so I want to talk about that for a minute, because we've never been a global society until maybe 100 years ago. I mean, we've always been tribal and city-states and nation-states, but to be a global society, and particularly since the Internet came about 40 years ago, or, I mean, when you started having this global, if you will, I guess even back with the different Morse codes, et cetera, and radio, that this connected us. It started to connect us as human beings around the globe. And so we have had to learn to get along. We've had to learn how to expand our borders and get out of our tribal states and our city-states. Now, of course, not everyone has chosen to do that, and that's where the conflicts are. But in the long run, we have chosen to be a global society. I mean, it's no going backwards. We are a global society. And that's where it's really about how can we each create that global society. Now, you asked about animals. They've already created a global society. That's what ecology is all about. That's what the harmony of nature, of the natural world is all about. So, yes, we can learn from them. We can learn from how do they get along. Of course, they're predators and prey, as far as eating goes. But the way they use each other's nests and dig water holes that then the other animals drink from, or someone cuts down a tree and that actually offers a new habitat for a whole other species, they work together and in tandem. And that's what we need to understand. It's all one big resource in the planet. So how can we actually, if you will, I was going to say parcel up that resource, and that sounds terrible because I don't want to parcel it up, but how do we use those resources where we use it in a sustainable way? And so sustainability is a whole other conversation with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals put out by the United Nations in 2015 that we're all meant to be living by, but probably no one knows what they are. So you can Google 17 Sustainable Development Goals and find out about those. So we have a lot we can learn from each other and from the animals.
I was thinking about when you're in an environment, you walk into a room and it feels really cold, like the energy is off in that room. Mm-hmm. And I want to give a shout out to all the dog lovers out there, and for people that are in the dating realm, right? You may really like this person, but your dog doesn't. And some people are using that as a cue, like the dog knows, right? You better pay attention because Fido's on top of that. And kind of tongue-in-cheek, we're laughing at it, but I think some of it's true. And I bring it up because of your one, because the big movie last year was A Dog's Purpose. And, that was pretty fun outside of what they were saying about animal cruelty, so I hope that didn't happen on the set. But I did want to bring up your services because you offer animal communication, you do peace coaching through Akashic Records, and I wanted to know if we could combine those with like A Dog's Purpose, like you do those coaching and communication with a person and their pet to see see what their synergies or what their purpose is to be together.
Yes. And animals pick up on our energy. Animals reflect our energy. And it's just, I remember just a quick story about I told you I took care of the orangutans at Los Angeles Zoo. And if I was in a pissy mood or something was upsetting me and I came in to put the animals in their night quarters and feed them their dinner for the night, they would not come in. They were like, "You got to be kidding. I'm not going to walk in that door, even though you got my food, in your hand. I don't want to come in because you are in a pissy mood and forget it." So what I had to do is I had to step back before I even came near the back entrance of that exhibit and go, "Okay, take a breath, Gail. I have all the time in the world. I'm going to go in and say hello to the orangutans, tell them it's a beautiful day, and here's their dinner, and come on in for the evening." And if I did that, man, they just jumped in like, "Yeah, okay, great, you got our food. This is perfect." But if, forget it. If I was it just had any of my energy off. So we've all experienced this with our dog or cat or bird or horse. Animals are just amazing. And so how is your life? It's really about the tools, and that's what a lot of the peace classes are, the peace brain training and the peace coaching with the Akashic Records is getting each one of us, our human being, in right alignment. And then, yes, talking to your animal and saying, "Okay, what else do you want your human to do? How do you want your human to be, to reflect its best self, And that really is what we're each wanting to be, right? Our best selves.
How many pets do you have, Gail?
We have 4 dogs. And as I said, we have been breeding these Coton de Tuliar dogs for years, but now we are stopping breeding. So we have the 2 parents and the 2 children from the last litter, the 2 boy and girl, sister, brother dog from the last litter. And that's our 4 now to be just stable dogs that we'll have for the 15 years. Yeah. So, what about you? What do you have?
Currently, I don't have anything. I had a dog for 14 years right before I came to Georgia, but he had died. He was 13, I guess, when he passed away, and so that was pretty rough, and I just haven't been quite ready to get another one. It's like, man, we'll just take a little break because it was pretty emotional. I don't know if I want to go through that again.
Absolutely. And they're a commitment. They're a family member. And it really is any kind of, we call them ownership, but really it's about caretaking, is a commitment. And how can I relate to that animal? I really, as a keeper, as you said, as we talked about, got really attached to the animals. And so everyone would kid, are you taking that little monkey home tonight to, and check your backpack that it didn't leave the zoo and go home with you type thing, which it was really tempting, but obviously didn't happen because they belong to their family too. So, yeah, lots of wonderful things. So we can create peace in our own life here. We can create these places where our energy can be, we can practice being at peace and talk to each other about what that is. That's the peace parks. When you go to the website tourismforpeace.com, check out the peace parks and the peace master plans and get on our World Peace Trails map.
You said something really that kind of struck a trigger as far as a compartmentalization. In your last example, when the orangutans knew how you felt and they wouldn't go in there and eat. And maybe because of, and not just you, I'm just saying as you as us as a whole, we at that time, you knew I had to change my energy in order for them to have it feel safe enough to kind of come in and so I can go home, right? Yeah. And in many cases, we compartmentalize that where for work, I'm willing to do, quote, unquote, the work. But I may come home and the person there knows there is an energy that's different, and you're like, what's wrong? Nothing. So we're picking up on those energies too, but it seems like we're more so able to, we have access to those tools, but we use them or compartmentalize it for work because that's what we have to do for our livelihood, but we're not doing it when we're off the clock.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. These tools, these energy tools, which, oh gosh, I mean, there's so many different ones that are out there for everyone to learn and to investigate and to practice, are 24-hour tools. You know, they're all day long and just to become. So whatever kind of energy tools each one of the listeners, each one of you can find, practice. You know, it's about practicing when it doesn't count. And so when you really need it, it's there, and it becomes part of who you are. Grounding cord, rose, all kinds of wonderful, whatever practice really you are attracted to is perfect then.
Now, you mentioned Belize and other places that you've gone on your tours. Are there upcoming tours that the listeners should know about that they could sign up for as well?
No, I'm busy writing the books. Not only the Opt for Peace book is in final draft form. It'll be published really soon. The Lucy books are coming up. They're the next in the series. It's this wonderful series of 9 young adult novels about this character named Lucy, a young 12-year-old girl who lives in Belize, and her mother owns a zoo, or is director of a zoo. That is this magical place. And she is to learn about peace powers from the animals. And so each book is a different country, a different peace power, a different animal species, and a different climate of culture of the human race, of what kinds of things she can learn from those human societies and solve different ecological challenges along the way. So it's a magical science and adventure story.
So there's a newsletter on your site we could sign up, or people can sign up for, so they'll stay abreast to know when the book comes out?
You can go to tourismforpeace.com and join our email list and learn more. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Any other questions, David?
Yeah, you just answered it. I was just going to ask her about how to find out more about the book or when it's coming out. So, yeah.
And I know people would be excited to check out your newsletter and see your site, but I think you're pretty active on social media as well, so I'd love for you to give out your social media contacts.
Yes, so Tourism for Peace has a Facebook page. The one I'd like you to go to is Peace Explorer. That's another one, a Facebook page that has, on both of those I post some really interesting things of what people are doing around the world actually to create peace and different new inventions that people have come up with. As something as little but it seems minor, but it's really fantastic, is a metal straw that fits on your keychain and folds up that you can take with you all the time, because straws are one of the worst pollutants in the world. Billions of them are out there, plastic straws, so we're dealing with this plastic pollution. So go to Peace Explorer on Facebook or Tourism for Peace and check out those. I'm on Twitter at Peace Explorer and on LinkedIn under my name, Gail Lash, and have my websites, of course, and go to worldpeacetrails.com and find out how you can hashtag Opt for Peace and make your own peace park. And as I said, get on a World Peace Trails map. So thank you. It's been a delight to talk today.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Well, you have just been in tune to another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. I'm Hamza.
And I'm David.
And Dr. Gail Lash, it was a pleasure to finally get you on the podcast. We got to stay in touch, of course.
Yes. Thank you. It was a delight.
Thank you.
Till next time, thanks.
All right.
Listen to Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective on Radio Public. It's a free, easy-to-use app that helps listeners like you find and support shows like ours. When you listen to our show on Radio Public, We receive direct financial support every time you hear an episode. Experience our show in Radio Public today by listening to the show link in our episode notes, and thank you for listening. Thanks again for checking out another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast. Please check us out on our website at intrinsicmotivation.life, where you can click on the Speak Pipe button and leave any suggestions for future podcasts that you'd like us to cover. Also, check us out on our social media sites. We have a YouTube channel, Facebook page, iTunes podcast, in addition to Stitcher and Google Play, all under Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. Check you out next time. Have a great day.